Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Barry Duncan, and I'd like to talk to you about the nuances of the outcome rating scale. Read all about the nuances of the outcome rating scale and many other things in the new PCOMS manual, an integrated e-learning manual for everything PCOMS. Feel free to explore all the resources on the betteroutcomesnow.com website, and if you're so inclined, friend me on Facebook or follow Bon on Facebook for all the latest about what's happening with PCOMS. So what we're up to today is to dig into the nuances of the ORS and talk about the skills of PCOMS 1 through 4, which includes introducing the ORS, which is a lot more than just flicking the forms. It's about discussing the score, contextualizing that score, making sense of the score via the clinical cutoff and the expected treatment response. And perhaps the most important nuance is connecting the scales to the client's experience and reasons for service. Unless we do that, the ORS will very quickly default to how the client is feeling that day or how things are going in general with them, rather than being about the actual work that we're doing with them. And finally, skill 4 is getting a good rating. And this means getting a good rating of the client's experience from their point of view. It has to match up with how they're experienced in their life and their reasons for service. To view the rest of the 10 skills of PCOMS, simply go to Better Outcomes Now, click on Articles and Handouts, scroll down to where it says Handouts, and click on 10 Skills of PCOMS, and there they are. First thing you got to know about the ORS is it ain't this, right? It's not a list of problems or symptoms rated on a Likert scale. It's completely different than that. In fact, it's different than any other outcome measure on the planet because it's co-constructed with the client. It goes from this general look at their overall distress to a specific representation of their reasons for service. So therefore, that means you have to show up to make those things happen. It requires a bit more nuance in skill and application than just flicking a form. The main thing about introducing the ORS is that you got to get across 2 points. First of all, the notion of monitoring outcome. This is what this thing is about. We're going to track whether or not you are getting what you came here to get over the course of our work together. And the other thing to get across is this whole idea that it keeps the client's view central to everything that happens in the service you're delivering. Or in other words, it ensures that their voice is heard and paid significant attention to. The other thing to keep in mind is this needs to be in your own words. You need to make it your own. Like everything else you do as a therapist, you need to make it your own, part of your natural, authentic way of working with folks. Given that everything is based on the intake score, given that it's the client's subjective experience that really matters, it's critical that the client gets why we are doing this, that they understand the ORS, the measurement process, what we're up to. The whole point of PCOMS needs to be something the client understands. The ORS has very good face validity. Most clients understand it right away, but if it takes more time for them to understand what it's all about, it's time well spent because, as I mentioned, everything is based on the intake score, and we want to get an accurate reflection of their experience and view of their life, as well as the reasons for service. It's their subjective experience that matters, so their understanding of the ORS is paramount to the PCOMS process. Sometimes clients will ask questions about the ORS. They'll want an explanation of what's the difference between the individual scale versus the overall scale, those kinds of things. Sometimes with kid problems, they'll say about the school scale, they'll say things like, well, my son is doing great academically, but he's getting expelled for these angry outbursts that he's having in the classroom. And then you just simply say, are you here to work with me around what to do about these angry outbursts in the classroom? Yes, that's it. So I'd like for you to rate the scale according to those concerns you have about that. That way it'll be a meaningful marker of our work together. So you just clarify, make it more specific, but you're always calling upon the reasons for service, the concerns that they have, the reasons that they are actually coming there to see you. You know, after you've introduced the measure and the client takes it, this is a very critical component to the client understanding what PCOMS is all about. And you facilitate that understanding by discussion of the clinical cutoff. And no, we're not decapitating clients or cutting them off at the knees. We simply are contextualizing their score next to this thing that's called the clinical cutoff. And you don't need to talk about the clinical cutoff. You can call threshold, the line that separates, and now that we have better outcomes now, you can say the line between the green and the mauve or pink. It simply is that number that reliably separates people who are seeking services from people who aren't. And for adults, the number is 25, and you can see for everybody else, it's 28. There you see the separation between the mauve and the green, and that is the so-called clinical cutoff. Clients are either above or below the clinical cutoff, so you only have two choices there. Everything about the choices of PCOMS are pretty simple. You don't have long decision trees to figure out. All you need to do is mention the score as it relates to the cutoff and have the client make sense of it. What you're essentially saying is the way that you rated this scale, the level of distress that you are reporting, does that fit for you? Is that right? You're also saying, and it looks like that you scored this scale lower than the rest. Does that make sense in the context of your life? So you're just checking out the way the client filled out the ORS and to see if it fits what they were actually trying to convey with the way that they filled it out. Scores under the cutoff or under 25 make more intuitive sense. It may seem more straightforward. They're reporting distress similar to others seeking services. Of course, the lower the score, the higher for distress. And the main thing to keep in mind and communicate is that folks that are scoring in that range are looking for something different in their life. They're looking for a change. Here's an example of that. This particular score, 8.8, is very low, and so you might want to say something about that as well. People who score as low as you have are really looking for some change in their life, and the sooner that happens, the better. Because someone that scores this low is really having a hard time. Is that right for you? So you want to kind of use it to validate the client's experience and to let them know you hear what they're saying here. And they're saying a person that scores 8.8, they're kind of giving you a neon sign saying, I'm one hurting cowboy or cowgirl here. And it makes some sense to make comment on that if you get a score this low. But the bottom line is that when people are scoring in this mauve range, under that clinical cutoff, they are wanting something to change in their lives. The other thing that you want to convey with folks is to talk to them not only about the clinical cutoff, but also about the expected treatment response or the trajectory of change that Better Outcomes Now puts out as soon as that intake score goes in. Now, you don't want to say expected treatment response, except if the client is the kind of client that would be interested in that kind of language. But what I like to say is that this curve represents here, this green line represents here, what we hope will happen if our work together is successful. It's a way that we're going to be able to track whether or not we're getting where we would like to be regarding the reasons for service or the reason you came in to work with me. So it's kind of like our compass. It's kind of like our way to keep us on track in our work together. You know, I'm going to say one of those things. I'm not going to say them all. You simply can say, this is the curve that represents what we will hope that will happen, and we'll use this to compare against how things are going so we know whether or not we need to regroup or not. Something to that effect. But again, remember, it's in your own words. Here's what you want to do. You want to convey the notion of monitoring outcome, ensuring the client's perspective remains central. You want to explain the score relative to the clinical cutoff and make sure it makes sense to the client. And you want to explain the expected treatment response or what we hope will happen for the client. I'd like to start with this brief form called the Outcome Rating Scale, which provides a snapshot of how you're doing right now. It serves as an anchor point so we can track your progress and make sure that you get what you came here to get. And if you're not, we can regroup and try something else. It's also a way to make sure that your perspective, how you're doing, stays central to everything we do. Would you mind doing that for me? The task after the score is plotted is to make sense of it with the final authority, the client. The clinical cutoff facilitates a shared understanding of the ORS and is often a step toward connecting client marks on the ORS to the reasons for service. So again, talking to the client when you have this graph in front of you on the iPad or whatever your device is. This measure, the ORS, based on where you touch the line, gives a score from 0 to 40, and then your score is plotted on this graph. So let's see if you think this accurately describes how things are going for you. You scored a 16.6. See the line between the pink or mauve and the green, this line right here? That's a score that tends to separate people who are seeking service from those who are not. People who score under 25 tend to be those who wind up talking to people like me. They're looking for something different in their lives. A change is in order. You scored about the average intake of persons entering therapy, so you are in the right place. And it's not hard to look at this and see pretty quickly that's the family close relationship area that you're struggling with the most right now. Does that make sense in terms of the way you're seeing your life? And this green line here, that's what we are hoping will happen if our work together is successful. It's kind of like our compass that lets us know that we're on the right track. So that's basically all there is to that. It doesn't take a lot of time. We just want to make sure we convey those basic points and ensure that the client understands and is on the same page as we are about this, because their understanding is critical to the success of PCOMS. But what about the folks that are over the clinical cutoff? Are we going to say, wait a minute, Buster, you can't be in here, you're over that cutoff? Well, of course we're not going to do that, right? So what can we glean from a score that looks like this? This person scored a 28.9. What can the ORS tell us about this person? And how can we use this information to begin or focus the session?
You're despicable.
No, we're not going to tell people they're despicable because they scored over the cutoff or we think that they may be mandated. Rather, one thing to notice right away about this ORS is that there's still one scale lower than the rest. And that's your engraved invitation to have a conversation. Because regardless of whether the score is over the cutoff, there's something there that is of concern to the client, and that may be just the good starting point with that particular client. But a lot of times people score over the clinical cutoff because they're mandated. But their lives could be going well, everything's going well, but there's one circumscribed problem that's not going well. For example, a relationship with a child or a partner. But nevertheless, most people who come in over the cutoff, over the score of 25, are mandated. If they're mandated, I have found it very useful, and in this 5-year contract I had with the Fort Lauderdale courts, I found it very useful to ask clients to retake the ORS from the perspective of the referral source, because I always got a lower score when I did that. It's an amazing phenomenon that when asked to rate themselves from the perspective of the referral source, it always came in a lower score. So it's not that clients are blinded to what other people are thinking about what their issues or problems are, and then that can be used as a catalyst for conversation. Remember that because clients are over the cutoff, it doesn't mean they're lying. They're just not in as much distress as those people who sent them there. So you don't want to stir the cauldron, you don't want to turn green and grow a big nose and say, oh, you don't think you have a problem? I bet I can find one, with a devilish kind of witch-like laugh. But if you're using Better Outcomes now, it enables another option that's actually pretty cool that allows you to ask another question about this and perhaps get a different score from the client. And let me show you what that would look like. So here's a client who scored 28.9, and you've already had the conversation about what the score means regarding the clinical cutoff, and also you've contextualized it and described the expected treatment response. And now after you found out a bit more about the client, you know that they have been referred there by somebody else, essentially they're mandated. You want to ask them to retake the ORS from the perspective of the person who sent them there. So there's a cool way to do that. All you have to do is first go back to the rater page and record their scores, exactly what they did, the 7.7 all the way to the 7.6, a total score of 28.9. Go back to the graph cage and then hit the redo. And the client then refills out the ORS from the perspective of the person who sent them there. And let's say in this case it's a probation officer, and the probation officer would fill this out quite differently. And in fact, they fill it very low on the individual because they believe that the person has a drinking problem. We save that, and then now we have this graph appearing, and we can discuss this with the person, and I would say, wow, looks like their view of you is very different than your view of yourself. How come you think that is? Well, Barry, they think I have a drinking problem. Okay, I get you. So they are rating you much lower because of their view that you have a drinking problem because of the DUI you got. Yeah, that's right. So what do you think we need to do in here that will bring their view of you more in line with your view of yourself. So that's kind of a nice conversation to have. It keeps you out of that kind of dynamic of saying that the client is actually more distressed than they are. But what we're really trying to accomplish here is to raise the score of the person who referred them there, or to get them more in line with the client's view of him or herself. Now, an interesting part that this allows you to do now is, at this point you've had this conversation and you're now ready to have the score, the client score, go back into Better Outcomes Now, and you say, do you want to take the ORS over, or do you want me to put the same scores back in from before? Think about that for a minute. So the client then has told you what other people think, they told you about their initial score, they may reconsider and give you a different ORS score, which may be a lower score and more reflect the reason for service that the probation officer or the referral source sent them in. It just enables another pass at that whole issue without you kind of bird dogging a person or pressuring them for a lower score, but just having them reconsider it in light of what the referral source rated them. Just a nice little additional way to have that conversation with the client. The next nuance I want to discuss is connecting the client's marks on the ORS, or their touches on the ORS, to their described experience of their life as well as the reasons for service. And this is the most important nuance of using the ORS. If you don't do this, big trouble ensues. You gotta connect their described experience to the marks on the scales. And the reason for that is that, as you know, the ORS is kind of a bare bones. Everybody has those broad domains in their life. It's just a skeleton. And the client's experience and reasons for service add the flesh and blood to those bare bones. At the moment the client connects their reasons for service to those marks, it becomes a meaningful indicator of whether or not they're gaining in therapy, and a place where you and the client know where you'll see gains if the therapy is successful. And if you don't do this, if it's not relevant to the work, if the ORS doesn't represent the reasons for service, it quickly becomes an emotional thermometer of day-to-day life. It quickly becomes how the client is doing rather than a representation of how the client is doing relative to the reasons for service. It is the default response on the ORS, and a thing that many people struggle with, and that is they don't use the ORS in a clinical way to connect to the client's reason for service, and then everybody after a while looks like this. They look like a mountain range. They have this kind of a graph, the sawtooth graph, the mountain range graph, whatever you want to call it. It's not a valid graph. It really doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't allow PCOMS to do its job to identify the at-risk clients so you can do something else about them. All you have to do is just make sure that you integrate the way the client scored the ORS into the clinical work being done related to the reason for service that the client brings up. So in this particular instance, the client has rated the individual scale lower than the rest, and then perhaps the client is talking about a general sense of anxiety they're having. Perhaps they are feeling malaise and not getting up and going to work. Perhaps they're having trouble sleeping. Whatever the situation is that they're describing to you, all you have to do is pick up the device and say, does the situation you're describing to me now account for your mark here on the ORS? And this is the actual graph page that you would be able to see this. This is the same one we just looked at, and you can see that all we would have to do is to wake up our device and say to the client, does this mark represent what you were just talking to me about? And then that leads to the next golden question: what do you think it's going to take to move this just 1 centimeter to the right? What do you think needs to happen on the outside in your life that would have you do that? And what do you think we need to do in here to support that happen? It leads to these nice conversations, keep things focused on what we're going to do to raise the ORS score, because this represents something real in the client's life. Last thing I want to talk about are bad scores. There are 2 reasons for bad scores. The client doesn't understand the ORS, and this can happen for a lot of reasons. People are anxious when they come in to see us. They want to get to their story. They could see this as just another form that they have to fill out with all the other forms they have to fill out to get service. So they may not really take the time to understand it before they launch into just taking it and handing it to you. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is the client is angry and they blow it off for whatever reason. They're mandated. They don't want to be there. They don't like the whole notion of being in therapy. Maybe something just happened to them on the way that they're angry, so they just kind of blow things off. Both of these scenarios. Client not understanding and angry and blowing it off will lead to scores like this. Or in other words, those scores higher than 32 that are likely not valid because they don't make much sense that people are doing this well or are talking to a therapist. So you don't confront or challenge. Do what you would normally do with clients. You talk about their score relative to the clinical cutoff, you describe the ETR, and then you ask them what would be useful for us to talk about. So you don't confront or challenge or worry about the high score. You just try to explain it and see and ask them if it fits, and if it fits, then keep moving. If it doesn't fit, they say, no, I didn't understand, or I blew it off, great. Then have them take it over again. There's a redo button there, and all is well and good. But if they don't do that, just go into your session. It's all okay.
Don't worry, be happy.
All you have to do is listen for something that comes out of the client's mouth that contradicts the score. Not something that someone else thinks, not something that you think, but actually something they say that contradicts the higher score. So if they have this high score and then they start telling you they're in an abusive relationship, or they have the high score, they tell you about being bullied at school, if they have the high score and they tell you about their struggles in finding a job, all of those things contradict the high score, and then you just have to ask for clarification. Help me understand something here. On this ORS form that you filled out, you reflected that things were going very, very well in your life. But on the other hand, you're telling me now that you've been in a relationship for a while that really hasn't been very good for you in a lot of ways. Can you help me understand this? Another way of doing it is simply to ask, where on the ORS is this situation you're describing to me now reflected? Is another way to go about exactly the same things. So PCOMS is not about flicking forms. You got to get data integrity. If you do some of the nuances that I've talked about today, you will get good data integrity and avoid having a lot of your clients scoring over the cutoff. You'll avoid having intake scores between 32 and 40, and you'll avoid having graphs look like a sawtooth or a mountain range. And don't forget about those 250 free resources at www.betteroutcomesnow.com. And if you're there, check out the new PCOMS manual, your all-in-one resource for PCOMS.